Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Grunwald, 1410. They came with banners, snapping in the summer wind, rows upon rows of knights in polished armour, sunlight glinting like fire off burnished steel. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of war horses. Dust rose in lazy curls, heat hanging thick above the plains of northeastern Poland. It was the 15th of July, 1410. And what stood before them was the greatest confrontation medieval Europe had ever seen. Two worlds, Catholic crusaders and Slavic kingdoms, hurtling toward collision. The Battle of Grunwald was not merely a clash of arms. It was a reckoning. It began years before, in blood and fire. The Teutonic Order, Germanic warrior monks sworn to God and conquest, had carved out a powerful militarized state along the Baltic. Their banners bore the black cross of crusade, but the wars they fought now were less about heresy and more about power, land and tribute. For decades they waged holy war against the pagan tribes of the Baltic, Lithuanians, Prussians and Samogitians. But by the turn of the 15th century, something changed. Lithuania converted. Not just a few nobles, not just a symbolic nod to Rome, a full political baptism of an entire kingdom, led by Grand Duke Jogaila, who had married the young Queen Jadwiga of Poland and taken the name Władysław II Jagiełło. That union created a juggernaut. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was now the largest realm in Europe. It stretched from the Carpathians to the steppes of Ruthenia, and it was Christian, but the Teutonic Knights would not let go. They questioned the sincerity of Lithuania's faith. They accused Jogaila of false conversion. They launched raids. They built castles deep into claimed territory. And so, the knights, who had once marched under the banner of Christ, now found themselves the aggressors in a political chess match gone wrong. In the spring of 1410, the Polish king and the Lithuanian Grand Duke began to plan. It was bold, risky, unprecedented. Instead of defending their fragmented borderlands against raids, they would strike at the Teutonic heart, Malbork Castle, the Teutonic Order's capital, a red brick fortress the size of a town, ringed with thick walls, towers, and a garrison that drank from the marrow of war. To take it, the Allied armies would need to march hundreds of miles in perfect coordination. Poles from the south, Lithuanians from the east, through rivers, forests, and hostile land. No single blunder could be afforded. But Jagiełło was a shrewd commander, quiet, calculating, deeply religious. His opposite number, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Ulrich von Jungingen, was bold, fiery, and ferociously proud. The men could not have been more different, and yet they would soon decide the fate of nations. By early July, 1410, the armies were on the move. Jagiełło led the Polish host, some 20,000 men, including heavy cavalry, nobles in gleaming plate armour, and levied foot soldiers, armed with long spears and crossbows. From the east came Grand Duke Vytautas, his cousin and Lithuanian ally, with another 20,000. His troops were a kaleidoscope of war, pagan Samogitians with curved sabres, Lithuanian nobles with lances, Ruthenians with padded gambesons and bows. Mongol Tatars had even joined the campaign, mercenaries from the steppe, riding wiry horses and speaking a language older than Latin. It was not a single army. It was a mosaic, and its commanders knew it had to move like one. The Teutonic Order, meanwhile, gathered its might at a place called Tannenberg, later known in Polish as Grunwald. Their force was smaller, perhaps 30,000 at most, but they were disciplined, professionals, knights and sergeants trained in siegecraft, shock cavalry, and formation warfare. And their confidence ran deep. For decades they had been the scourge of the East. Their coats of mail had swept aside tribes and dukes. Their castles had never fallen. They did not believe they could lose. At dawn on the 15th of July, the battlefield lay wide and open, a stretch of meadowland flanked by forest, the morning sun hanging low and golden. The Poles and Lithuanians emerged from the trees in long columns, tens of thousands of men unfurling into position, their banners whipping in the breeze. The Teutonic Knights watched from the far side, their white cloaks lined in black, faces hidden behind visors. Among them stood German mercenaries, Czech crossbowmen, and even English and French knights, drawn by gold and glory. Then came silence. Not stillness, for the horses stamped, the banners rippled, the archers whispered final prayers. But a breathless tension, a pause, and then 2 Teutonic knights rode out under a flag of truce. They carried swords, unsheathed, gleaming in the light, and presented them to Jagiełło and Vytautas. A taunt, a ritual, a call to arms, and the king accepted. The swords would be remembered as the Grunwald swords, symbols of challenge and defiance. Moments later, the order was given. The Lithuanian cavalry surged forward. Imagine the sound, thousands of hooves pounding the earth, a thunderous roll like distant drums. The riders shouted war cries in Lithuanian, Ruthenian, even Tatar. Arrows flew, axes gleamed. They crashed into the Teutonic right flank with devastating force. But the Germans were ready. They formed into tight ranks, spears out, shields braced, absorbing the charge with practiced precision. A brutal melee erupted, steel on steel, cries of pain and the shriek of horses pierced by lances. Dust rose in choking clouds. The heat was suffocating. The men fought not just enemies, but thirst, exhaustion, and fear. A Lithuanian boyar, face smeared with blood, hacked wildly at a knight whose helm refused to split. Nearby, a Ruthenian archer dropped his bow and fought with a curved dagger, blood pooling at his feet. For hours the battle raged on that flank. Then, suddenly, the Lithuanians broke. They turned. They fled. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men and horses pouring back across the field in what looked like full retreat. The Teutonic Knights saw it and cheered. Victory, they thought, was already theirs. And this is where the tide began to turn. Because it was no simple rout. Vytautas had planned it. A feigned retreat, drawing the enemy cavalry into pursuit, away from their carefully arranged lines. The Lithuanians peeled away into the woods, but they were not done. Meanwhile, on the Polish left, Jagiełło waited, watching, still. He prayed beneath a pavilion as his men held formation, letting the Teutonic centre inch forward, overconfident and exposed. When the time was right, he struck. The Polish heavy cavalry charged with devastating force. Banners fluttered, trumpets sounded. The clash was like thunder. Jagiełło's knights carried long lances, each one tipped with a narrow iron point, designed to punch through armour. They hit the Teutonic centre like a hammer, and suddenly the battlefield was chaos. Ulrich von Jungingen, the Teutonic Grand Master, now saw his lines faltering. He donned his finest white surcoat, mounted his charger, and led a charge straight into the Polish ranks. It was valiant, it was brave, and it was suicidal. His unit was cut off, surrounded and brought down. Ulrich fought on foot until the end, swinging his sword with bloodied hands. But he was killed, likely stabbed through the throat. His body would be found hours later, stripped of armour, lying beside his standard. With their leader dead, panic began to spread through the Teutonic ranks. But the battle was not over. Not yet. As the sun began to dip, the Lithuanians returned. They crashed into the Teutonic rear, screaming vengeance. Now, caught between two fronts, the Knights of the Black Cross began to fall back, then crumble, then run. The field was soaked with blood. By nightfall, it was done. The Teutonic Order's army had been destroyed, their banner torn, their might broken. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms lay dead or captured. Polish and Lithuanian troops moved cautiously through the field, stripping armour from the fallen, searching for wounded comrades. Smoke rose from campfires as the victors tended to the living and counted the dead. One squire wrote that the earth itself had turned red, the blood of the godless had washed it clean. It was one of the most crushing defeats in medieval European history, but this was only the beginning of the reckoning. Malbork still stood, its walls untouched, its vaults full, and the aftermath of Grunwald would reshape the Baltic world. The once invincible Teutonic Order would never recover its former glory. But as night settled over the corpse-strewn fields, a new world had already begun to take shape. Dawn broke cold the next morning. A chill mist clung to the wreckage of the battlefield, curling around broken pikes, shattered shields, and bodies bloating in the sun. Carrion birds wheeled overhead, the cries of the wounded mingled with the groans of dying horses. Jagiellon stood in silence, his cloak wrapped tight against the morning wind, surveying the carnage. He had won. But the war was not over. Grunwald was a thunderclap, but it had not yet shattered the walls of Malbork. The fortress still stood, untouched, unbeaten. Jagiellon's war council convened quickly. Some urged a rapid march north. Strike now, they said, while the enemy is broken. Others hesitated. The men were exhausted. The battlefield had left them low on supplies. Vytautas had already begun withdrawing Lithuanian forces to secure gains in the east. The unity that had carried them to Grunwald began to fracture in its aftermath. Still, the king decided to move. Within days, the Polish host was pushing northward, slow, ragged, but determined. On 25th of July, 10 days after the great battle, they arrived before the gates of Malbork Castle. There it was. The high red walls, smooth, towering, and defiant, rose like a fortress from legend. Malbork wasn't just a castle. It was the very soul of the Teutonic Order. Built along the Nogat River, its layered defences bristled with towers, drawbridges, and curtain walls. Thick moats and inner bailies made it nearly impervious to siege. And within those walls waited Heinrich von Plauen, a lower-ranking commander, still in his 30s, not the Grand Master, but already a name to watch. When news of Ulrich von Jungingen's death had reached the castle, von Plauen didn't falter. He rallied what forces remained, called in local garrisons, and began immediate preparations for a siege. His resolve would prove vital. The siege of Malbork was nothing like Grunwald. No glorious charge, no open field, no clear lines, just mud, rain, sickness, and time. Jagiellon established his camp on the far side of the river, raising royal standards and calling for the towns of Prussia to surrender. Some did, others hesitated, some resisted, but the castle remained sealed. Polish artillery in Narrated, such as it was, hammered the walls. Primitive bombards launched stone balls with more noise than accuracy. Siege towers were attempted, but quickly abandoned. The defenders replied with bolts, arrows, and taunts. They poured boiling pitch from murder holes. At night they lit torches and rang bells, mocking the besiegers, letting them know they were ready. Inside, von Plauen had rations carefully measured. Scribes worked by candlelight, sending desperate letters to allies, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the Pope, to any who would listen. Help us! The barbarians are at the gate. But help did not come. Not in time. Instead, the defenders endured. For weeks the siege dragged on. The Polish army, stretched thin and far from home, began to suffer. Supplies dwindled. The summer heat turned to storms. Dysentery crept through the camps. Morale sank. Jagiełło sent letters urging cities to stay loyal, threatening retribution for betrayal. But loyalty in Prussia was fickle. These were not simply Polish or German lands. They were a crossroads of faiths, of languages, of power. The war was not just fought with steel and fire, but with coin, parchment, and doubt. And then a decision was made. On 19th September, barely 2 months after Grunwald, Jagiełło lifted the siege. It was not defeat, but it was not triumph either. The king withdrew his forces southward, burning what supplies they couldn't carry. Malbork still stood, bloodied, yes, shaken, but unbroken. For many of Jagiełło's soldiers it was a bitter pill. Grunwald had seemed the end, the final blow. But the order had not collapsed. And now, months later, the Teutonic Knights began to recover. With astonishing speed. They called it the miracle of Malbork. And in truth, it did feel like one. Within weeks of the siege's end, reinforcements began trickling in. German nobles, mercenaries, clergy, all rallying to the order's defence. Diplomats flooded Europe, reshaping the narrative. The Teutonic Order had not been aggressor, they claimed, but victim. They spoke of barbarism, of slaughter, of churches burned and crosses trampled. And in many halls their version of the story took root. But not everywhere. The reality of Grunwald could not be undone. Not the graves, not the broken swords, not the silence that had fallen over once proud Prussian towns, and not the change it had awakened in Eastern Europe. Because now, for the first time in a century, the Teutonic Order had been challenged, not by heretics or pagan tribes, but by a coalition. Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Christian kings and pagan allies, a force beyond the Black Cross. And something else had shifted. The myth of knightly invincibility, the shining armour, the unbroken charge, had been shattered. At Grunwald, peasant footmen had dragged noble knights from their horses. Ruthenian archers had cut down German lancers from the shadows of the trees. The battlefield had spoken, and it said, "No man, however holy, however armoured, is invincible." In the months that followed, diplomacy replaced steel. Both sides sued for peace. Neither could afford another campaign. And in 1411 the Peace of Thorn was signed. The terms? Mild. Too mild, according to many in Poland and Lithuania. The Teutonic Order retained most of its core lands, including Malbork. It paid reparations, yes, but not crippling ones. It ceded some disputed regions, but it endured. Jagiełło had won the greatest battle of his age, and yet the war had delivered no final reckoning. Why? Because war is not chess. It is not a game with neat endings or total victories. It is fog and flame, noise and silence. It is memory and consequence. Yet in the eyes of Europe, everything had changed. After Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights would never again command the same fear. Their aura, that air of divine right, of unstoppable crusade, had cracked. The Pope no longer spoke of them with the same urgency. Imperial courts began to drift. And in the shadows of Eastern Europe, new powers were stirring. Vytautas returned to Vilnius a hero, his name now legendary in the East, the man who'd outwitted the knights and turned the tide. But even he knew that something more lasting had been born. A vision, not of Lithuania alone, or Poland alone, but of a joint destiny, a shared strength. That alliance would endure. In fits and starts, yes, but it would shape the region for centuries, and as for Malbork, it remained a monument to defiance, to pride, and to the simple, brutal truth that even in victory some walls cannot be taken. Of course, it is one thing to win a battle, it is another to live in its shadow. In the years after Grunwald, the fields of northeastern Poland slowly healed, at least on the surface. Grass grew over the bones, the broken shields rusted, the names of the dead were swallowed by time, but Grunwald refused to be forgotten, because even as the swords were sheathed and the treaties signed, something deeper had shifted. Not just the borders of kingdoms, but the rhythm of power itself. The Teutonic Order limped on. It remained wealthy. It retained Malbork. But the gleam was gone. The fear they once commanded in the Baltic faded like an old banner in the wind. The Holy Roman Emperor still called them defenders of the faith. The papacy still issued formal blessings, but in private the whispers grew louder. They had lost, and worse, they had bled. Across Prussia, towns once loyal began questioning their allegiance, the taxes, the levies, the endless wars. What once seemed divine obligation now felt like dead weight. And when the order raised its hand again to extract more coin, more men, more grain, the people pushed back. By 1440, that resentment exploded into rebellion. The Prussian Confederation, a league of towns and nobles, rose against their masters. They petitioned the Polish crown for protection, and Poland, now stronger, bolder and more cohesive than ever, answered the call. What followed was the 13 Years' War, a brutal, grinding conflict that ended with the Second Peace of Thorn in 1466. This time the terms were not mild. The Teutonic Order was forced to cede half of its territory. It became a vassal of the Polish crown. Malbork, that once proud fortress, changed hands. The Black Cross was lowered. The White Eagle was raised. The Crusader state was no longer sovereign. It had become a ghost of itself. And still it faded further. By 1525, what remained of the Teutonic Order's land was secularized altogether. The last Grand Master, Albert of Brandenburg, converted to Lutheranism and declared himself Duke of Prussia, a title granted not by Rome or war, but by the Polish king. The sword had become a scepter, the cross a memory. In just over a century, the mighty crusading order that once ruled the Baltic through terror and fire was no more. But Grunwald was not only the end of something, it was the beginning of an idea. For Poland and Lithuania, it became a founding myth, not just of victory, but of unity, of standing together against greater odds, of resisting foreign domination. That story would be told and retold, in paintings, in poems, around hearths and in cathedrals. A vision of knights and peasants, nobles and pagans, all shoulder to shoulder, beating back the invader. In times of foreign occupation, when Poland was partitioned, when its name was struck from maps, the memory of Grunwald burned like a buried ember. A reminder that the nation was not merely a border or a crown. It was an idea. In 1878, the Polish painter Jan Matejko unveiled his monumental canvas Battle of Grunwald, over 4 meters tall and 9 meters wide. It depicted the moment of Ulrich von Jungingen's death in vivid, writhing chaos. A tangle of limbs and banners, blood and fury. It was not just art, it was defiance. At the time, Poland did not exist as a state. Its lands were controlled by Russia, Austria and Prussia, and Matejko's painting, though censored, threatened and nearly destroyed, became a rallying cry, a roar from the past. The painting survived, and so did the idea. Even in the 20th century, Grunwald remained potent. In 1940, as Nazi Germany stormed across Europe, Hitler ordered the SS to create a film about the Battle of Tannenberg, the German name for Grunwald. But it wasn't to honour the Teutonic defeat. Quite the opposite. He wanted to rewrite the story, to reframe the knights as early heroes of German destiny, and their enemies, Poles and Lithuanians, as barbarians. Propaganda. A lie. But the lie revealed the truth. The memory of Grunwald still mattered. It still had power. When the Soviets retook Poland from Nazi hands, they too seized on the battle's symbolism. Grunwald became part of state rhetoric, a tale of Eastern victory over Western aggression, of Slavic resistance to German imperialism. Streets, schools, and monuments took the name. But beneath all the state slogans and the shifting flags, the heart of the story remained the same. It was a tale of resilience. And yet, like all great stories, Grunwald is not simple. It was a clash between Christians, between crusaders and converts, between kingdoms both proud and flawed. It saw terrible violence, not only on the field but after. Prisoners executed, churches looted, villages razed. War does not offer clean lines. There are no perfect sides, only choices made under pressure that shape the lives of thousands. But what Grunwald does offer is perspective. It shows us that power is never permanent, that dominance can be undone in a single day. That unity, even messy, fragile, temporary unity, can change the course of history. And it reminds us that the past is not dead stone or faded ink. It breathes, it bleeds, it burns. So if you ever stand on the fields near the village of Grunwald, and you can, walk slowly. Let your eyes trace the horizon. Let the wind press against your skin. And remember that once, right here, the earth shook beneath 20,000 hooves, and the fate of a continent trembled in the balance. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.